When the Dali cargo ship crashed into a vital support column of Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge early Tuesday morning, a series of tragic events followed. The bridge collapsed into the Patapsco River, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the country, with massive fragments of steel and concrete landing in the water on the ship and across its 4,700 containers. 8 construction workers who were repairing potholes on the bridge when it collapsed fell into the river. 2 men were rescued, 2 were found dead, and the remaining 4 men are presumed dead. But this tragedy did not end when the bridge fell. It remains an ongoing crisis that will have ripple effects across the country. Here's where we stand this morning. Wreckage removal began yesterday with highly trained demolition crews cutting parts of the collapsed bridge into smaller sections for safe removal by crane. Those pieces will then be taken to disposal sites. Maryland Governor Wes Moore said yesterday that recovery efforts for the 4 missing workers have been paused due to water temperatures and other hazards, but divers will remain on standby until it's safe to return to the water. The Port of Baltimore, normally one of the country's busiest shipping channels, is currently choked off, threatening supply chain issues that will be felt far beyond Maryland state lines. The channel has been the top domestic port for cars and a major hub for forest products, farm equipment, and sugar. The port closure also means lost work. For many who work at the port, their work is either slowed down or stopped immediately. It's also affecting smaller waterfront businesses, not to mention the bridge itself was a crucial artery for commuters in Baltimore. And the big question remains, who is footing the bill for this disaster? While a network of insurance companies will likely cover a portion of the expenses, the Biden administration approved $60 million in immediate emergency federal aid. President Biden doesn't want to stop there. He hopes the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing the bridge, but he would need support from a fractured Congress to get the funds approved. Earlier this morning, I spoke with Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg about this funding question and the efforts to repair and rebuild the bridge.
Secretary, what type of timeline are we realistically looking at for the bridge to be fixed, the channel to be cleared, and for business to return to where it was before this happened?
We haven't yet received a timeline. I think the Army Corps of Engineers and their partners who are working under the unified command of the Coast Guard don't want to speculate until more is known about some of the conditions there, including the conditions of the portions of the bridge that did not collapse. A lot of work has to be done to assess those, even to know what's going on with some of the underwater infrastructure. What we do know is that we need to get this port back open as soon as possible, deal with the supply chain implications in the meantime, and get that bridge back up as soon as possible and deal with the traffic implications in the meantime. Those 4 lines of effort are getting support from not just the U.S. Department of Transportation, but really the entire federal administration in partnership with state authorities who are leading the process of that rebuilding under the leadership of Governor Wes Moore, county, city, everyone pulling together. The SBA is involved in trying to get credit to impacted businesses. My colleague, Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su, is on her way. I will be there later this week to engage with some of the workers who were impacted. Just a remarkable level of collaboration and cooperation to support the people of Baltimore and to support everybody who is affected by this. These effects will continue for some time.
So you named a lot of groups and people who are involved collectively to get this fixed. And generally speaking, when things like this happen, everybody bands together. But in order for the Biden administration to pay for the bridge repairs entirely, you do have to get Congress on board. I don't know if it's a widely held view, but one always worries about these things. The Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Dan Muser, said, quote, "It was kind of outrageous immediately for Biden to express in this tragedy the idea that he's going to use federal funds to pay for it in its entirety." Rather, Congressman Muser suggests that this come out of electrical vehicle infrastructure. We have a fractured Congress. How do you foresee having to deal with things like this?
I think the congressman's view is relatively unusual. Generally, there's bipartisan consensus around the idea of emergency relief funds from the federal government. We have a whole system and an account designed for that purpose. And there are many times over the years when there has been a dramatic event like this, and federal assistance has been key to getting things back to normal. I think about the Minnesota bridge collapse in 2007. Different in the sense that it wasn't caused by a collision, it was caused by a design flaw in the bridge. But the point is, getting that bridge back up and running took about $260 million of federal funding. And there was strong, swift, bipartisan support to get that done. Our hope is that that will be the case this time, too, for any funds that are needed. We already moved the first $60 million in emergency relief funds. Those are going to things like clearing the wreckage and some of the things associated with the early steps toward getting that bridge back up. And look, I know this is a divided Congress, but this is also a Congress that came together on a bipartisan basis to get our infrastructure bill done in the first place. If we could see Republicans and Democrats cooperate to get President Biden's infrastructure package through, surely they can cooperate to help America and Baltimore deal with this tragedy.
Secretary, one of the things that we're still grappling with in this economy, otherwise very strong economy, is how to keep inflation under control. And one of the key inputs into inflation over the last several years during COVID has been supply chain. What's your response to folks who treat this as a local Baltimore or even a Maryland issue, given the fact that if this doesn't get fixed in relatively short order, we start seeing supply chain problems?
Yeah, if we've learned anything over the last few years, it is how incredibly interconnected our systems of supply chains are. We saw that with the backups at the West Coast ports in 2021 that were a consequence of COVID. We've seen it any other time that there's an individual point that gets impacted, like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. And we're seeing it here. Having said that, I will say we are much better equipped than we were just a few years ago to deal with this sort of thing. We have new mechanisms in our department, including a multimodal freight office that was actually created as part of President Biden's infrastructure plan that have allowed us to coordinate among the different players. A couple days ago, I convened a group of about 100 players, from shippers to cargo owners, involving the trucking and railroad sectors as well as ports, to see everything that we can do to get through these disruptions. What we're seeing is that there are East Coast ports that can temporarily absorb the traffic that would have been headed to Baltimore, whether we're talking about the containers or vehicles, but it's not the same, of course. Baltimore is specialized, it's large, it's an important part of the system, and there's certainly no substitute for the traffic into Baltimore from the perspective of the workers, which is why it's so important to make sure that we're supporting those longshore workers who support our economy, who every one of us counts on for 90% of everything in our homes, whether we realize it or not.
Secretary, some lawmakers will be more willing to spend federal funding on repairing the bridge and port if the insurance and shipping companies pay the costs for which they are responsible. Insurance companies often try, as they typically do, to establish a legal cap on the money that they have to put up. Is your department going to have a role in establishing that number or protecting those who might need to sue those companies for anything that comes out of this?
So there's going to be a lot of complicated legal and financial work ahead to make sure that any party found liable proves to be accountable. But what we know is that that can't be something we wait for to get the port back open and get the bridge back up. That's why the president has directed his entire administration, including my department, to get those funds together now so that funding and bureaucracy can never be a barrier to getting this work done. But of course, work is already underway in the dimensions that you talked about to make sure that any party that is liable or responsible does what they need to do.
Some people are saying that the owner of the ship, the Singapore-based Ocean Grace, is going to invoke something called the Limited Liability Act in order to protect itself from being held liable for the full cost of the damage. That law was originally written for wooden ships 173 years ago. What's your thinking on this?
I can't get into that yet while the investigation is still playing out. We're all looking to the independent National Transportation Safety Board for the findings that they will ultimately put forward, as well as other parties on the law enforcement side involved in investigating this. I will say this: every time there's a major incident, America learns from it, and sometimes that means updating engineering designs or technology. Sometimes that means updating our policies and laws. And when you see something as dramatic and shocking as the site of the Key Bridge collapsing into that harbor, I am sure that is the kind of major incident that, just like so many others in our history, America will learn from.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both think about infrastructure a lot, and I hadn't really anticipated something like this happening. But now, as we read about it, we learn that the Francis Scott Key Bridge was unique for its span and its clearance height. It was the third longest contiguous truss bridge in the world. There are only 8 other bridges in the country that have the height, the clearance that this one has. And according to the Wall Street Journal, all 8 of those bridges are vulnerable to collapse if a single one of their support piers is compromised, as was the case here. How are you thinking about those vulnerabilities? I know this wasn't something that we typically thought about before this week, but now we have to.
Well, this is something that I think engineers are assessing and debating right now. What I will say is that we're investing in the resilience of our infrastructure for the future. It's another part of President Biden's infrastructure package. We've been looking at that from the perspective of seismic resilience, of durability of bridges, and certainly this incident is going to give America's bridge builders and engineering community a lot to think about. There are countermeasures that have been built around more modern bridges, especially since the 1980 bridge incident in Florida, where dozens were killed and injured after a tanker struck and effectively similarly took out a bridge there. Of course, the Francis Scott Key Bridge was built before that, but since then, more and more countermeasures have been developed. It's just too soon to say whether any such countermeasure would have made a difference in this particular case, where you had the force of about 248 million pounds directly impacting the key support pier for that entire bridge.
Secretary, good to talk to you. Thank you for your time this morning.